Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. Why does Ray Epps get cover from 60 Minutes, etc.? All the media that gives him cover. Well, my guest today was an independent journalist on the ground at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. And he wrote almost a 10,000 word report about what he did that day. And the FBI still tried to get him to admit to a crime that he didn't commit. He's covered trials like the Oath Keepers from the courtroom, and that is why I wanted to have him on the show. We need factual information right now in this country more than ever about everything, but especially about what did and didn't happen on January 6th. Steve Baker's an independent journalist. The Pragmatic Constitutionalist is how I ran across him on Twitter, and he's one of the very few Americans with the courage to report the truth about what he sees and experiences. He's just published a piece about Ray Epps' post 60 Minutes interview that clarifies why many people still believe that Epps is some kind of government operative that instigated at least a great portion of the riots that occurred on January 6th. Steve, sir, welcome to the Rob Maness Show.
Hey, Rob, thanks for having me.
I really appreciate your time, man. You're a busy guy, and I wanted to get you on the show for quite some time. I first ran across you, like I said in my monologue, when Julie Kelly from AM Greatness was sharing your stuff out of the courthouse on the Stewart Rhodes trial, and those, I think, first 4 or 5 folks that did that. The surprising thing, Steve, is that there weren't very many people, if at all, doing what you were doing in that trial.
Yeah, it was a lonely room, particularly if you were on my side of the political aisle. There were a lot of reporters in the media room. On any given day, there would be 20 or 30 in there. And finally, the Epoch Times sent a young beat reporter down to join me. She had actually been sitting up in the courtroom itself, which was tough to work from because you can't bring your electronic devices into the courtroom itself. So they do have a media room with large screens down there and audio coming into the media room. And so it's easier to work there because we can use our laptops. And she finally came down and joined me. So she's a 27-year-old Romanian girl that works for the Epoch Times, and she became my best buddy for the next 9 weeks of that.
Well, I followed every day. I would check in on your threads from the night before after I discovered you, because there really wasn't. Nobody was telling the story in a factual way. I mean, everything's got a twist to it. It seems like these days, and what really impressed me was the way that you were telling the story about what was really happening and asking the right questions. But one of the things that I didn't realize at the time, and I found out later as I was reading more of your stuff on Substack and everything, is that you were actually on the ground on January 6th. How did you come to be there in that particular location?
Well, it's a long story if I gave you the more expanded than the Reader's Digest version, but I'll give you the short version very quickly. When the COVID lockdowns happened in early 2020, when I say they, government took my job away from me. I'm a professional musician by trade, have been in the music business for over 40 years, and I play music. That's what I do for a living. I'm a trumpet player. I'm a singer. I had 3 bands at the time. And then all of a sudden, as we learned, that 2 weeks to flatten the curve became 2 months and then became almost 2 years. I effectively was not allowed to work for almost a year and a half at all. And so during that time, I decided to ramp up this side of my I wouldn't call it at that time a career. It was really more of a hobby, but I'd been writing for 25 years, doing political and social commentary, that sort of thing, news analysis. I had my blog, and I had social media presence all over the place, going all the way back to CompuServe and AOL, and then they became MySpace, and MySpace became Facebook, and then Facebook became blogging, that sort of thing. So I had been doing that for, as I said, for over 25 years. And then all of a sudden I had all of this free time on my hand. hands. And so I started traveling a lot during the lockdowns, and I traveled to 28 states, actually going from state to
Wow.
state, town to town, and meeting with followers of my blog.
Hmm.
And we would do what I called my meetups, and sometimes it was in private homes, sometimes it was in restaurants that were open. Some of these places were operating as almost as speakeasies during the lockdowns, depending upon what state we were in. But we were having a great time, and I was having a great time spending all of this lockdown time on the road, meeting with people. And then I finished the first run that I had done in on actually New Year's Eve of 2020, and then I went back home to Raleigh, North Carolina, where I live, and I basically washed all my clothes and intended for January 6th to be my first stop on the next leg of my tour.
Okay.
And yeah, and so and it was not because I'm a Trump supporter, because I haven't been, and it wasn't because I uh, expected anything like what unfolded that day, but I was
Hmm.
there specifically to cover an event of which I expected it to be unlike anything that had preceded it before. And again, not knowing what it would become, but
Yeah.
there was an anticipation from Trump's messaging and from some of the other messaging from his followers and hangers on, that there was going to be a big release of information that day. Maybe it was the
Yeah.
Kraken. You remember
Yeah.
Sidney Powell talking about releasing the Kraken. Well, I thought maybe
Hmm.
that would happen that day. So I loaded up my bag with my camera, my tripod, and my man on the street microphone, and I was going to go out and I was going to interview people afterwards and see what they thought about this big release of information,
Hmm.
obviously regarding the election.
Right.
And to be quite frank with you, it was a nothing burger from the stage, from the rally stage at the Ellipse. The speeches revealed nothing, not even Trump's, and
Hmm.
it was very cold that day. I was there with another writer. I won't name him, but he's a writer of some esteem, and he and I traveled up from North Carolina together for the event. And so we were freezing and we were bored, and we knew that the events that were scheduled were moving towards the Capitol later that day. There were scheduled events and
Yeah.
marches and that sort of thing. So we wanted to get ahead of that, and we also wanted to move. So we
Hmm.
took off walking at a very brisk pace from the Washington Monument lawn and started working our way to the Capitol. And by the time I got to, for people that are familiar with the area on the west side of the Capitol, where the reflection pool is and the
Right.
Peace Monument, by the time I got there, we could hear sirens rolling up, and we could see Metropolitan Police in their fluorescent vest streaming down the steps from the other side of the Capitol down to the lower terrace. And I looked over at the other writer and I said, well, that's where we're headed. And we broke out in a sprint to that direction. And by the time we got there, the battle was fully engaged, and then the day unfolded from there.
So on your way down there, and I'm very familiar with it. I worked at the Pentagon for a couple of years when I was on active duty. So I used to jog up the
Mm.
mall and all that to
Hmm.
the Capitol and back and those kind of things. So on your way up there from the Ellipse, Washington Monument area, I mean, what were you seeing as far as people were concerned? I mean, the
Well,
speech wasn't over when you left there,
right.
right?
Yeah, I left almost exactly halfway through his speech. He did not
Okay.
take the stage until 11:57 a.m., and that was an hour late. He was supposed to start speaking at 11 a.m., and that threw all the other scheduled events out of kilter at that point. And then he stayed on the stage. He finished speaking, I think, at 1:11, and then he left the stage at 1:16. Well, by 1:10, I was already there at the reflection pool.
Okay.
And so we saw thousands of people already peeling off and heading that way. Most, I would assume, had the same idea that we did. They just wanted to get moving. The temperature that day wasn't extremely cold, but the wind was
Yeah.
25, 30 miles an hour. And so it was just miserable. It was cutting and biting. And so being able to get a good brisk pace going and get the blood flowing was our
Hmm.
primary objective at the time. And as I said before, because of the size of the crowd at the Ellipse and at the Washington Monument, we wanted to get ahead of that. So
Yeah.
that was what we were doing. And then on the way over there, we saw just the average workaday, middle class American Trump supporters, MAGA people working their way that direction, of all ages, all types. There was an interesting aspect of that it didn't dawn on me till later, and after I started looking at my own videos, is that all the way from the time we arrived at the Washington Monument lawn at 9:30 in the morning, and then all the way in our walk over towards the Capitol just before 1 o'clock, not a single law enforcement officer ever entered my frame in my camera. Not once, not anyone.
Wow.
And that was not something that I noticed in the moment,
Hmm.
but when I started doing frame by frame analysis of my videos, that was the thing that one of the first things that just really leapt out at me as something very strange and very odd. And then, of course, by the time we got to that, as I said, the reflection pool and the Peace Monument area, the restricted area barricades that had originally been up, of course, the famous Ray Epps breach there on the west side, those were all gone. In fact, again, upon just being part of that walk over there, by the time we arrived, there was no sign whatsoever that there had ever even been a restricted area. There were no do not enter signs or area closed signs. There were no bike rack barricades. The what they call the snow fencing had been cut down and removed and hidden. And this all happened in a very, very short period of time, because that breach that Ray Epps was there for were the first assault really on law enforcement officers that took place, where Carolyn Edwards of the Capitol Police was pushed over and hit her head on a concrete step and was knocked unconscious. That happened at 12:52 a.m. So I was there just 20 minutes later, and there was no sign whatsoever that there was a restricted area previous to our arrival.
So were you when you got past that point, or when you passed that point, just like you've written, I've seen you write about it many times. You had no idea that there was ever a restricted area there. Quite frankly, I've been there during national elections for the president and everything, and I don't recall ever seeing a restricted area around the Capitol on that day.
Right.
So I would have been very surprised to see that too, or to know that it was even there. But I think is that the reason why the FBI really wants you to admit to committing a crime, is that you entered an area they say is restricted, but you didn't know it was there?
Well, that was a real focus of their interview, and they didn't call me till, gosh, it was about 8 or 9 months after the event when I finally got a call. And of course, by then I was clearly on the record by multiple stories that I'd written, videos that I had done, interviews that I had participated in. I had my own videos had been broadcast and used by the HBO documentary, the New York Times documentary by then, had been used by news services all over the world. And so there was no hiding the fact that I was there, and I had no reason to hide the fact that I was there. And so by the time they called me, and I remember it was about, I think it was a Thursday morning in August, and I actually I was still doing my touring. I was still traveling everywhere, and I had an event. I think it was a suburb of DC. I think it was in Renton, and I was supposed to speak to I think it was a Libertarian Party meetup group up there on a Friday evening. And on Thursday morning, I got a call, and the guy introduced himself, and he said, "Hi, this is Special Agent Doss of the FBI, and just wondering if you'd have a few minutes to talk." And I said, "Well, what took you so long?" And that was
That's what I was wondering what you said to him. That's what I would have said too.
First
Where have
words
you
out of my
been?
mouth. And he said, and then he said, "Well, I see that you're going to be in Renton tomorrow night, and I was just wondering if you were going to be here early enough that maybe we could, sit down with you for a couple hours and talk, and just talk about your day there on January 6th." And I said, "Yeah, actually, I'm planning on being there early, but the truth of the matter is I'm sure my attorney wouldn't be able to be there with me. So probably not something I should do. He was like, oh, okay. Well, we can reschedule that when it's convenient for you and your attorney. And that's what happened. I turned it over from that point to my attorney, gave him Agent Doss's phone number, and I never spoke to them directly again until the interview. But in that interview, to get to your question, they were very focused on trying to get me to admit to some level of criminality. Now, by the time we actually had the interview, we actually had an aborted interview where my attorney and I showed up at the FBI field office one day here in North Carolina, and they met us at the door, two of the special agents, and they told us, hey, we have a problem. We may not be able to interview you today. And I thought maybe there was some national emergency going on. Maybe, maybe ISIS or Al Qaeda had thrown some more planes into some more buildings or something. I had no idea what was going on. It's just they had an emergency or something that was going to prevent them from doing the scheduled interview. And they came back from the back rooms about a half hour later, and they said, well, here's the problem. He said, because of your status as a member of the press, we have to receive permission. It's in the U.S. Code. We have to receive express written permission from the Attorney General's Office of the United States to even interview you. We cannot question a member of the press without that permission. And I went, okay, great. So then there was some negotiations between my attorney and the Department of Justice. There was a proffer agreement made. Basically, my interview was set up in such a way that nothing could be used against me that I said in that interview unless I perjured myself. Only if I perjured myself would I be subject to any penalties for what I said. So anything I said in that interview, even if I incriminated myself truthfully by anything I had done, they would have had to get me on another testimony or on the stand or under oath in some other capacity in order for that to be used against me. So I had no reason to perjure myself, so I answered their questions truthfully, but they really kept drilling down on trying to get me to admit that I knowledgeably entered a restricted area at the time. And that was at each level and each step of my progression, because I did eventually follow the story inside the Capitol building.
Right.
As many other journalists did.
Absolutely. I mean, there's video from journalists all over the place, both independent and linked journalists to the legacy stuff. So is it because, do you think it's because, this is an opinion question, so do you think it's because their narrative is so pinned to this obstruction charge that they try to get people on to beef up the sentences and those kind of things?
The obstruction charge, the insurrection insinuation, because obviously there's been no charges of insurrection against anyone. They've managed to get it up to the level of seditious conspiracy with some of the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, but no insurrection, although they still, to this day, that's the words that they use. That's the word that the politicos, the politicians, the journalists on the left side of the media, they still use that word insurrection all the time, although, as I've said, there has been no one charged with actual insurrection.
So, considering they spent several hours with you, and we see all these people, I call them the MAGA grandmas and grandpas, a lot of them. I mean, some of them are even going to prison for a certain period of time, or they're asking for prison time that's lengthy, considering the types of crimes we're talking about. And by these things, I mean the folks that were nonviolent, so the nonviolent crimes, considering all of that, you must be absolutely stunned that this Ray Epps guy has not at least been charged with something.
Well, I'm stunned on several levels. First of all, there's every reason that he should have been. And I have had many discussions with several mainstream, large news agency journalists, particularly because of my time there in D.C. during the first Oath Keepers trial. I had a lot of time to spend and have meetups and lunch and coffee and breakfast with some of these guys. And so there were a lot of discussions that circled around the differences of what I would call selective prosecution of certain witnesses, particularly the widely ranging differences in sentencing for people that had committed or pled out to the exact same crimes. Why would one individual for what I call the glorified trespassing charge be sentenced to 3, 6, 8 months in prison, whereas another person only got 2 years probation, $1,000 fine, and maybe a few hours of community service, something like that. So there was a lot of disparity in the sentencing. So we had a lot of time to talk about those things, and one of the things that was very, very difficult to get these mainstream journos to agree to is that Ray Epps should have been just as well. He should have received, if not at least the minimum accusation, arrest, charges for the 4 basic misdemeanors, particularly which is so evident to me, and as I wrote in the column that I released last night, was the fact that if anybody knew that he was entering a restricted area that day, it was Ray Epps. He went through 3 different breach lines, in which the first one was clearly marked, clearly designated closed area with signs on every section of that fencing that was put up. It was clearly guarded by Capitol police officers.
Yep.
He was there. He whispered something in Ryan Sampson's ear, and 5 seconds later, boom, the first assault against a law enforcement officer takes place. They pushed that fence over, and Carolyn Edwards fell back, hit her head. And then he broke out in a dead run to the next line. And then from the Capitol closed circuit television camera, we could see that when the second line burst through at the very point of its breach, who was standing there? Once again, Ray Epps.
Yeah.
And then you fast forward from there over an hour and a half later, when the final West Side battle line, which was on that lower West Terrace, which I filmed myself for right at an hour. But when that one finally collapsed at around 2:30, 2:35, he was there yet again. Now, there's not I haven't seen camera imagery of him being at that singular breach, but that was more of a giant, it was a huge pullback. There was a point where obvious commanders from the Metropolitan Police said, "We're done. Let's go." And they all started turning. About 100 officers started walking inside that tunnel or going back up and around to their vans if they were Metro PD, that sort of thing.
Yeah, when I read your article about that particular timing event, it made me wonder, and maybe you did see it, where in time and location the relationship of the non-lethal munitions being fired into the crowd. Were you around that area at all? Is that the area where Epps was at?
Yes. Yes.
Was that the last one?
Yes.
Okay.
And of course there's and this is where I part from some of my own J6 investigators that are out there doing this independently. There's a lot of accusation that the Capitol Police or the Metro Police were the ones that elicited the violence from the crowd by the release of these less than lethal munitions. And I'm sorry, but that's just not the case. That's factually errant. And it's very important for those of us who are doing this to endeavor to get every single detail absolutely right. And as I've talked about in many of my articles, I wrote a 9,500 word first column about what I experienced that day and what I saw that day. And I published it a week later on January 13th. And I go back and I can look at that and I can find that I made some errant assumptions or observations, but it was what I had available to me in terms of data at the time. And then I'm not a strictly hard news guy. I do comment. I take what I see and then I expound on it by my opinion and by my experience. And so I know that I got a few things wrong. In my second column, which was another very long one, it was only about 3,500 words though. I wrote a column that came out on February 24th, so 6 weeks or so after the event. And that one was entitled "Who Was Up the Chain on January 6th?" And I was exploring who was giving the commands that precipitated the things that I saw happen before my eyes. And again, there were things that I saw at the time or things that I knew at the time that I may not have gotten exactly right. But I've made attempts over the last 2 years to correct those errors as data and more video and more evidence has come
Sure.
forth. And I think that that's the only fair way to do this. And so one of the things that I've been trying to get across to some of these other guys, independent journalists, and those who are really hardcore, on the right side of the political aisle, very defensive about the MAGA crowd that was there that day. They have kind of drawn a line in the sand to say that if the police had not acted first, metaphorically drawn first blood first,
that is the storyline.
yeah, that the MAGA crowd would not have reacted in the way they did, and that's just not true. I was not at the 1252 initial breach, but we have camera angles from all sides that clearly show that the provocateurs on that front line that were standing there with Ray Epps, they initiated the first push and the first breach. There was no provocation whatsoever coming from the Capitol Police that were on the other side of that line. And they were, in fact, the first ones to draw first blood with the assault on Officer Carolyn Edwards. And then they moved very quickly up to the second line, and the Capitol Police established a second line. There was a semi-permanent black metal fencing that had been put up for the inauguration. It was already established. So there was a clear area for them to form a second line that they retreated to. And then hundreds and hundreds of more people were coming up and gathering. And then that's when the second breach happened. There had been no munitions, less than lethal or otherwise, released up at this point. So once again, the crowd aggressively and violently pushed through that police line and established another breach. The police officers pulled back yet again so there were some steps. They call it the lower terrace, but even that terrace is tiered a little bit. Yeah. And they pulled up on some steps up there, and then they were bringing out bike rack, and they established a bike rack barricade right there, which they held then for about an hour and a half.
And that's where, when I see pictures of the crowd, kind of, it's an empty space with police officers inside the perimeter there, and then the crowd is just built up around this. I think that's what I'm looking at later in the day after the first two breaches there.
Yeah.
Now, did you see any of those non-lethal munitions being used at all?
Yeah. Or? I've got a ton of it on my own video because by the time I started rolling tape, as they say, at 1:19, and the very first thing that I captured at 1:19 p.m. were individuals on the civilian side of the police line receiving first aid, and there were already law enforcement officers on the other side receiving first aid. So the battle had already been going on at that moment. Well, since the first breach, that getting close to half an hour, and so that was a shock for me, because obviously that's not why we went to D.C. that day. But then, as I said, as the story developed, I had no other choice but to follow the story where it went. And so for the next hour, I began to capture video of what was happening on both sides of that line. And, I amazingly, Ray Epps never comes into my camera frame, but I caught the QAnon shaman and a ton of other of the famous, more famous characters that were involved in various escapades that day on both sides of the line. I captured quite a few of them.
When you talk about provocateurs at the beginning of the line, I saw Epps. I've seen that video of when he whispers in the ear of Ryan. Is it Sanson?
Samsel.
Samsel. And then immediately the barricades go down, and the first officer is hurt.
Right.
Are those? I know Epps is a MAGA guy. I'm not even assuming that. I mean, he was an Oath Keepers leader, and he says it and those kind of things. Who were those other guys, like this kid Ryan? And he looked like he's pretty young in the. Do we even know who those provocateurs were?
Yeah, a lot of them have been identified. A lot of them have faced charges, have been arrested for either violence or misdemeanors of different sorts. But there's quite a few that are still unidentified. Quite a few that were in that initial breach. There were some Proud Boys in that initial breach. There were
Hmm.
unidentified provocateurs that we are still hoping to find out who they are, and we have clear facial recognition on many of those. Some of those are on the FBI's January 6th most wanted list. Most of those are on what we call what they call the sedition hunters, which is a open source online sleuths. Most, of course, they are working directly with the government,
Right.
and they are attempting. They spend, I don't know how many of them there are doing this work, but we know that they're not only here in the United States, but they've got people in Europe sitting in their mother's basement all day long on the internet, trying to source out and find out who these unidentified individuals are. But it's a really mixed bag. I mean, we know that John Sullivan was there at that initial
Hmm.
breach, of course, and he is a self-professed Antifa BLM activist.
Yep.
Nobody can deny that. He is the most prominent of those. I've interviewed his brother.
Hmm.
And then there are a handful of individuals who were or are, whichever the case may be, rabid MAGA guys, and that they threw themselves into battle that day, believing that they were on a mission from God, and that they were justified in doing so because of the violence that was um, that the police responded to with less than lethal munitions. And then, of course, because once they got into wrestling matches and fist fights on the front line, there were some people that were drug across the police line and got the kicked out of them by the police, and
Hmm.
maybe aggressively, maybe over aggressively, but in the heat of that moment, in the heat of that battle, if anybody was there on that line, you'd understand that passions were running hot on both sides of that line. And as I wrote in my Capitol Police series, I have a 3-part series on that. I, I I wasn't trying to play both sides. I'm just trying to be an honest broker. And
Yeah.
one of the things that you have to do is you have to put yourself in the position of a Capitol police officer who showed up that morning thinking it was going to be a regular day at the office, and you weren't notified of anything in particular or special going on that day, which is a whole nother story
Yeah.
because
It,
that's a
it is
very,
a
very
huge
specific.
part of the. It's a
Yeah.
huge part of the
This is a
story.
huge
Yeah.
part of why the conspiracy theories thrive, and justifiably so, is because of the lack of information that was given to the Capitol Police frontline officers that day. But I wrote in part one of my series, imagine if you were a Capitol Police officer and all of a sudden your radio goes off at 12:52 or 1 o'clock and you're being called out to the West Terrace, and you
Hmm.
come running out. You don't have any body armor on. You don't have any protective gear. You don't even have eyeglasses or face mask or so much as a bicycle helmet. And all of a sudden you run out there and people are beating on your fellow officers, and they're
Hmm.
trying to penetrate this line. And then as you look over their shoulder, you're seeing coming down the mall thousands of people are coming, and you have no idea what their intention is. You have no idea why they're coming. And all you're seeing is there's violence right now happening right here. There's blood. I mean, it was bloody back there behind the police line. There was blood everywhere. These guys
Hmm.
were being hit. Those, remember that black fencing that I referred to?
Sure. Yeah.
Those provocateurs started breaking that fencing apart into sections and started using it as clubs and spears, and were launching those spears. A cop got hit right in the face and then just gushed blood by one of those sharp, jagged edges from that I think it was painted black aluminum, and those spears were just being launched over and over and over again throughout that day. And so there was a lot of violence coming from the protester side of the line directed at those officers. But as I said, you can imagine walking to that line and looking over their shoulders and then going, oh my God, am I going home
Yeah.
today? And
Yeah.
some of those guys, by personal testimony, called their families when they would get a break and told their wives, tell the kids I love them. I may not be home today.
Sure.
They had no idea what was coming at them.
Yeah, it's in a situation that large with that many human beings, it's very difficult to pin things down, and I think that, just like you said, it lends itself to the conspiracy theories. But one of the things that I like about your reporting, though, Steve, is that you try to stick to the facts, and the facts are what are going to help us solve
Yeah.
the questions, and answer the questions. And in that last article, you just lay out the facts of the unasked questions about Ray Epps by the New York Times and 60 Minutes and MSNBC and all, and Adam Kinzinger, and
Yes.
that's what I have a problem with is they choose not to ask the questions about the facts that you know about. You were there.
Yeah.
You've seen the CCTV video. A lot of us do. And I like the way you put it in your article. We didn't create the conspiracy theory. The lack of answering the questions is what has created the conspiracy theory, and that's
Right.
really coming from the media and the government.
That's right. And when the FBI is asked in senatorial or congressional testimony, was Ray Epps an agent or a confidential human source or some sort of operative working for the FBI, and the FBI itself says, I can't answer that question.
Right.
Okay. Is that because they were under oath that they wouldn't answer that question? And then you send it back into the sphere of the news media. So now now they hand the ball off. All right. So that we go from that congressional or that senatorial committee testimony. Then they hand the ball off. Let's go to the January 6th House Select Committee. Then Ray Epps, first of all, does an interview in which we never get to see the content of. He participated in an interview that ended up never being released to the public, and it was archived into the National Archives for what they're telling us now could be 20 to 50 years before that document will be released. And then they released his second interview, which was there's no other way to say it. It was so obviously scripted, so obviously softball. I mean, they were those Congress members were giving him leading questions, and then asking him questions exactly just as a for instance, if you are a witness in a criminal trial, for instance, and you are a witness for the defense, and then the defense attorney comes up and does the direct examination and then says to you, wouldn't you say that? And you're basically giving them the leading question to answer the prepared rehearsed answer for the presentation, because that's what happens in these trials. And the same thing happens on the other side. The government has their witnesses, and then they walk up there and they ask the leading questions that have already been rehearsed. The witness has already been prepped. And that's exactly what we got from the Ray Epps testimony that was the one that was released to us in the public transcripts. And it was laughable when we saw that. And and I wrote about it. We commented on it. I did a whole tweet storm on it when that document came out, and then the ball is handed off to the media. Well, you already had the New York Times do their puff piece on him, and then now it's been handed off to 60 Minutes, and one wonders, and one has to ask the question: what is going on with the timing of this, and why yet again are they putting Ray Epps on a national left-wing, mainstream media bullhorn, and once again defending him without asking the hard questions, because nobody will do that. And that ultimately is the problem that I see with, as you said, or quoting what I presented in my article last night, was we didn't create the conspiracy theory. You did. You
Yeah.
did government, Department of Justice. You did FBI. You did New York Times. You did 60 Minutes. You created the conspiracy theory because you won't ask the hard questions. And and the theme that I kept going back to in that article, and it is a theme that I have held throughout this entire January 6th debacle, is that it's the lies of omission that keeps the conspiracy alive. It's the lies of omission that convicted the Oath Keepers in the first trial. It's the lies of omission that I saw every single day from that media room, because those mainstream, large bullhorn press individuals, they told the truth. What they wrote in their columns that I read every
Hmm.
night, whether it was CNN, CBS, New York Times, Washington Post, NPR, down the line, Reuters, AP, blah, blah, blah. They're all there in the room. I would read their stories, and the one thing that I noticed was everything they wrote was accurate. It's what they left out that didn't allow the story to be accurately told. And I was pointing that out during the trial, as you remember,
Yeah.
during my own tweet storms from the media room at that trial. And that was the biggest problem. And that was a huge eye-opening experience for me, to be looking at the back of the heads of these other professional journalists and then read their stories tonight, and then come back in the next morning and unspoken, I would just kind of stare at them and go, and in my head, I'm going, did you watch the same trial I did yesterday? And of
Yeah.
course they did, but
Sure.
they have the restrictions of the narrative, their own personal agenda, and of course, obviously, their editorial restrictions that they have to adhere to in those big news service newsrooms. And that being an independent, I don't have any restrictions.
Yeah.
I don't have any strings or anybody pulling, yanking my chain. So I was able to just call it out for what it was as I saw it.
Now you just said it for a second or third time, is that what these folks are reporting is accurate. Uh, but one of my questions is that, and you mentioned it earlier in our discussion, is that the word insurrection is
Yeah.
used over and over again to build this narrative.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I just think that as somebody that's defended our national security in this country for over 3 decades of his life, I just find that potentially very damaging to the United States.
It is, and that certainly is a huge inaccuracy, but it's part of that narrative that Pelosi called for on the
Hmm.
first anniversary of the event, and all of those commemorative events that she put together that week in January, the first week of January of 2022. And she specifically opened those events by saying, "We are looking to," and this is an exact quote, "to establish and preserve the narrative of January 6th." And that's what they have done. And they have had the assistance of not only the mainstream press bullhorns, they have had the assistance of big tech, because
Hmm.
obviously big tech blocked us out from being able to report accurately. I mean, just still today, I mean, putting my story about um, Ray Epps that I wrote last night on Facebook, just you can just see the algorithms throttle it down and yank me down. I can put a stupid meme out there about you know Bud Light or something like that and get 100,000 views and 2,000 likes or whatever. But if I put a real news story out there, whether it's about January 6th or whether it's about COVID-19 or anything else that they need and feel that the narrative needs to be controlled, all of a sudden, my nobody, I 40 over 40,000 followers on my Facebook page alone, and when only 300, 500, 600 people see it, that the
Oh,
algorithm has me smashed because of the key words in that story.
yeah, I have over 200,000 followers on my Facebook page, and I'm very lucky if 1%
Oh,
actually gets to see anything.
yeah, yeah.
It's
That's exactly right.
And it's just another, suppression of the facts, and look, I'm a Trump supporter, but I wanted to get you on here because I know you're not one,
Mm.
and you're not wedded to a political and ideological viewpoint on the situation that happened on January 6th. But the lack of the factual reporting and the bits that, yeah, what they do put out is true, the
Hmm.
truth, or factual, fact based. But the bits they leave out helps establish and reinforce this narrative that Nancy Pelosi has said we
Hmm.
want to preserve, and I just think that's so dangerous for the country for them to be able to get away with that. The one of the other big questions that I think people should know is that when you wrote your article that we're talking about, you laid out factual pieces of information about Ray Epps and what he knew and what he did, and it's all based on the facts.
Hmm.
So you mentioned in there that when you were talking about the FBI, you didn't see any restricted area signs, you didn't see any closed area signs. So they, all you had to do is tell them the truth when they were trying to press you on it
Right.
on admitting to violating a restricted area. But Ray Epps, he knew. I mean, it's all between your videos, the CCTV video, and other videos. I think you put a still in your article that shows the barricade of the first breach
Yeah.
where Carolyn was injured, and it's right there, closed
Right.
area, right on those bicycle racks.
Exactly.
So it just puzzles me why he's being protected like this. Because
It
I mean,
it
we
is.
we are sending, and I think you mentioned the one lady that is most egregious to me, the older lady that has cancer is going to probably go to prison for some period of time if she hasn't already.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think she did her 2 months already.
yeah, but even a day for those nonviolent crimes like that, when Ray Epps is right there on video, he's right there before January 6th, encouraging people to go into the Capitol. I mean, of all the people, of all the Americans that could be charged, he's not one.
Yeah, and you would think that they would at least give him some sort of slap on the wrist to
Yeah.
try and tamper down the conspiracy theories and shut everybody up. And I mean, let's charge him with 3 or 4 misdemeanors. Let's drag him through the process. Let's bring him out on the other end with a slap on the wrist, 2 years, 3 years probation, $2,000 fine, something like that, and shut everybody up. And then they can just go, hey, he's convicted of the crimes he committed. All right, he
Yeah.
didn't. We don't have him on video committing violence. That's a little bit controversial because he did have his hands on that big, giant racked sign that was being pushed and used as basically a battering ram against the police officers, and
Hmm.
other individuals who had their hands on that sign were in fact charged and convicted of violence. He had his hands on that sign and he was not charged for that. So once again, there's some selective prosecution going on from the Department of Justice just in that situation alone. And then, as we've already said, because when I write in the article that ignorance of the law is no excuse, that of course is a misinterpretation of
Hmm.
an older axiom, but
Yeah.
it's basically the way that the legal notion of that old saying or yarn is that ignorance of the law that you should know about is no excuse.
Right.
And that's why I wrote in the article that every first year law student knows that bromide is incorrect. Ignorance of the law is in fact often an excuse in a trial or in a defense of yourself, because there's a million laws on the books. We can't possibly, no attorney can possibly know all the laws that are on the books. As we've heard before, the average person commits between 3 and 5 felonies a day, and we don't know that we're doing that. Um,
True.
and that's why one of Stalin's aides said, "Show me the man, I'll show you the crime," because
That's right.
it's impossible for us to obey every law. And so, with that context laid, this is a man who could easily be convicted and not be able to sit in an FBI interview and say that he didn't know that he was entering a restricted area, as I was able to successfully do because they knew that I was telling the truth. By the time I arrived exactly where that barricade was, where he breached it at 12:52, that barricade was gone. Those signs were gone. There were hundreds of people that had already preceded me into that area, and we have the video and the film of those early provocateurs who obviously had the sign. There were people who had their job was to cut that fencing. They brought. Who goes to a Trump rally and brings wire snippers with them?
And that's on video. I've seen the videos
Yes.
of those individuals rolling
Who
up
does that?
the snow fencing.
Right. This is a job that he had that day, and that was his. And as he rolled them up, and then he turned them over, and he flipped the signs over, and then they were taking barricades and throwing them over, concrete and brick walling to get it out of the way and out of the sight of the thousands of people that would be arriving after them. This happened. We have the video. This is not controversial. I mean, a lot of people haven't seen it because obviously, as I also wrote in this article, if the Washington Post, New York Times, NPR, CBS, NBC, ABC don't say it, then it never happened. Well,
Right.
because over half of the country has never seen those videos, they don't know that this happened, but it did.
Yeah.
It took place.
And I don't think a lot of those folks have been identified and caught yet.
No.
Those are the ones that I want to see caught,
Yes.
tried, and convicted. Get a fair trial if you can get one still under this situation. I'm not convinced that will ever happen again for anybody involved in this. If not for any of us, quite honestly, that are of the wrong political persuasion, depending on who's in power. But yeah, it just. You would think these sedition hunter folks sitting wherever they're at would be going after those folks nonstop. The scaffold commander guy, the individuals rolling up the snow fence and throwing the barricades over the walls. Those are all pieces and parts to the beginning of the story of the violence that need to be answered. And a lot of the conspiracy theories will be addressed with the facts if we can find the facts on those individuals. Don't you think?
Well, I'm convinced because I know this is also not conspiracy. We know for a fact that the sedition hunters and a couple of other groups, the Capitol hunters, and there's a couple of other of these what they call open source intelligence groups that are looking for these individuals. They work very closely with the FBI, with the Department of Justice, and with members of the mainstream media. And I have absolutely, and I am now offering you opinion, but it's experientially based, that there is enough coordination and collusion going on between these groups that there are, in fact, certain individuals they do not want looked at. And for that reason, we will A, never know who they are, or B, they will be eventually corralled and given some sort of slap on the wrist, which again goes back to Ray Epps, which is still that makes no sense to me that he has not been. I mean, there is a guy here that is flagrantly, blatantly guilty of very specific crimes. He is the most photographed. He is the most videoed inciter, provocateur of moving people toward and into the Capitol that day. And by all video evidence, he knew that he was participating in the breaching of restricted areas. For that reason alone, he should be charged with something. And yet, and it's mind-boggling. And again, as I pointed out, okay, first of all, the Department of Justice, the entire left-wing press, and all of the grassroots left-wing voters in this country think that the Oath Keepers were the tip of the spear and are literally the most vile, evil, seditionist, insurrectionist, white supremacist, right-wing extremist of any group on the planet. This is how the Oath Keepers have been characterized since day one.
That's
All
right.
right. Well, Ray Epps used to be a member of the Oath Keepers. All right. He's a rabid Trump supporter. Okay. He's an election denier on top of that. And then he's on video telling people to go into the Capitol. Then he's on video literally breaching fenced off, do not enter signs, patrolled and guarded by law enforcement officers that were pushed over and violently injured by the group that he was with. And for some reason, the entire left-wing universe circles wagons around him.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Well, maybe we can end this this discussion with an eye on something that will tease people about it. You mentioned this in your article. Tell me about the red flare.
Oh, God.
And the 8 guys. Now, keep in mind, folks, this Ray Epps guy is on record saying that he was there, I think, by himself, and on record with a text message to one of his family members that says that, yeah, I was there right up front, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing now, and I orchestrated it. I think orchestrated is one of the words that he used in his text messages. But at the very end there, and you point this out in your article, talk to this audience about these 8 men, the red flare, and all of a sudden these 8 men come up and they basically escort Epps somewhere. What is going on there?
Yeah, and I'll lay the groundwork on that a little bit. When 60 Minutes started the advanced promotion for their feature of Ray Epps this past Sunday night, they were running, I mean, just all over social media, Facebook and Twitter, everywhere. They were running all these short, 30-second to 1-minute clips of the interview, and I mean, they really were. I don't know that I've ever seen them hype an interview like that before. I follow, because I follow mainstream news services. I follow them. I had never seen so many different individual clips for any interview they've ever done, and that's going back as far back as I can remember. But they were obviously hyping this interview for some reason. So finally, on Twitter, I took the link from Gary McBride's, which is what does he call it? I think it calls it M5 News, and he's the equal opposite guy of the sedition hunters. Okay, he's on the other side, and he is doing the same kind of open source intelligence video work. From his his bedroom or dining room table or wherever he does his work, and he's been working on the other side, trying to uncover and show these discrepancies that you and I have been talking about especially these unnamed conspirators or provocateurs or unidentified co-conspirators in the crowd. And so one of the things that he stumbled on back here a couple of months ago was he was able to access some of that hidden video. Now, I have no idea what his sources are. I know what mine are. I know why I've been able to access some of that information because of my work with some of the defense teams in the Oath Keepers trial, and I actually signed the court protective order. So I was given access to a lot of things that I can't talk about, I can't write about, and I can never show, or I would, in fact, land myself in prison for contempt of court.
Sure, yeah.
And the point being is he was able to access some of this Capitol CCTV from the west side, long-range shot going down, and he was able to zoom in, and he was able to, first of all, identify Ray Epps at the second breach. So he found him at that second breach, and then as you go forward in this particular video compilation that he has, now you're jumping forward an hour and a half or more in time, and this was after the final swarm of protesters had overwhelmed the police, as they say, or the pullback had happened, whatever the case may be. The point being is that now there is no more restrictions from law enforcement on the west side, and just thousands of people are up and over. They're on the upper terrace, they're on the balconies, they're everywhere. It's a pile of people by the thousands, sea of people. And he was able to zoom in and identify Ray Epps in the crowd. So he circles him in that crowd, and then all of a sudden, you see a red flare go off about maybe 10 feet from where Ray Epps is. And instantly, Ray Epps is then escorted out of that crowd, and it's like a snake because they're in that what they the Department of Justice referred to in the Oath Keepers trial as the military stack formation.
Yeah, I
Basically,
know.
they're in a single file line, and you can see
Yeah.
a couple of them got their hands on the shoulders of the person in front. Well, Ray Epps is in the middle. There's 4 men in front, 4 men in back, and they start winding their way through this massive crowd and working their way out. And he zooms in and he's able to identify. And and Ray Epps stuck out like a sore thumb. 6'4", 6'5". He's got the camouflage gear and the red hat, and he's just a big guy, and he was easy to identify in the crowd. But then to have him escorted out by these 8 other men leads us to a question. And that's why when all this promotion from 60 Minutes happened, I posted on one of their promo ads and I posted the link to that video. I said, "Are you going to show this video?" And of course, nobody responded from CBS or 60 Minutes. And of course, they didn't answer. And of course, they didn't show it. And I even said when I posted it, I said, I'm going to, I forget exactly how I said it, bet a month's wages or whatever that you're not going to show, this video in your story. And of course, they didn't even show any of that. They didn't come close to showing the more expository evidence against Ray Epps' behavior that day. And of course, especially not that, because now you have to ask the most difficult question of all. In your testimony, Mr. Ray Epps, before the House Select Committee, and in these interviews that you have done with New York Times and otherwise, you have said that you were there in D.C. only because your son and his friend were going, and you and your wife talked about it and said, well, I need to go there and, make sure he's safe because, people come out at night and everything. So the only reason you got on the plane and you flew out there was to be there with your son and his friend, and that's it. No advanced planning, no coordination with anybody else. But for some reason, when that red flare goes off, suddenly you have 8 protectors to escort you out of that crowd. Who were those men? Where did you meet them? And how did they know at that moment to take you out of that crowd? Well, I showed just 2 weeks ago today, I was sitting down with I have to be really careful because He's a confidential source, so I have to be careful about. And it's a very elite group of special forces from the United States military. I've already talked about them being from the Army, so I don't mind saying that. But he happened to be a member, not on the day he was elsewhere, but he happens to be a member of the special forces unit that I identified as having been embedded in the crowd that day. And I identified that for the first time back in my second article, all the way going back to February of 2021. And so I'm interviewing him 2 weeks ago today, and I showed him that video. And I do this regularly when I'm interviewing people. I've interviewed Treasury Department agents. I've interviewed former FBI. I've interviewed, of course, I've developed a network of Capitol Police sources. And when I sit down with them in person and I show them videos, I'm getting information, I'm getting reactions from their areas of expertise. My area of expertise is not the special forces of any service of the military or otherwise. And so when I show them these things, I'm looking for reactions, I'm looking for commentary, I'm looking for them to give me analysis from their perspectives, and as I said, from their professional experience. And in this particular instance, as he watched that video, the first thing he said, of the red flare, he said, we would call that an avalanche signal. I said, what's an avalanche signal? He says, get out now.
Yeah.
And as you can see, he said it was instantly, within seconds after that red flare went off, that the 8 men formed up around Ray Epps and started walking him out. And he said, from my professional experience, he said, I'm just telling you that's planned and that's coordinated.
It absolutely is planned and coordinated. I've been in command of large groups of men and women in law enforcement and security, and it absolutely is. I can confirm what he said. So, Steve, thank you very much for spending this time with us and helping get more facts out. The more we can do this, the better off I think the whole country is if folks can just find the information and listen to it and then just lay the facts on the table, and that's what you do. Tell folks where they can find you and how to support your work.
Yeah, I am. I'm actually not on Substack. I'm on Locals, which of course is kind of
My bad.
Substack-like.
Yeah.
As Glenn Greenwald just moved over from Substack to Locals recently. But all my work is there. I can be found. I'll give you the long URL first, and then I'll give you the short version. It's the Pragmatic Constitutionalist.locals.com. The Pragmatic Constitutionalist.locals.com, or on your phone app or device app, or you can enter it in your browser as well. I've shortened that URL up for access. It's tpc4usa.com. TPC
Okay.
the number 4 USA.com, and of course that's where you can find me everywhere else. That's where it's at TPC4USA on Twitter, at TPC4USA on Facebook and Gab, and wherever else we. I don't even remember where we all are now, but you can either type in the Pragmatic Constitutionalist or type in TPC4USA, and it'll get you there. But Locals is our home base. And
Okay.
And while it's it's free to subscribe there, but then like the other sites similar to that, there are paid levels where you can support us for as little as $5 a month or just one-time donations. So yes, we definitely need that.
Okay, well, yeah, I fully understand that you do need that, and we will mention that at every point to get out and support people like you, because it's very important, and the big types like the New York Times, they got the billions of dollars, but they don't put all the facts out, and they choose not to do that. So we've got to make sure we have people out there that have the courage to do that. And my friend, you are one that does, and I think you're an American hero, and hope you keep going. Someday I want to get you back on the show so we can talk about your music profession and spend 30 minutes to an hour discussing that, and people can learn more about you, because I learned that this time around. I didn't know that about you. So I'll be excited to look forward to that if you get the time to do it someday.
Awesome. Thank you, Rob. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve. God bless you, and have a great one.
You too.
Steve Baker, the Pragmatic Constitutionalist, folks. Follow him on Twitter and all the other social media. It's at TPC4, the number 4, USA, and TPC4USA.com. Support him. He needs your help in order to keep doing what what has really become a profession for him, in my opinion. An independent journalist, recorder of the facts, and reporter of the facts. That's what we need here in the United States of America today. Thank you all, and until next week, I'm Rob Maness.